Dozens of world leaders and hundreds of business people from around the globe have been meeting all week at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng addressed the gathering, and he called for free trade, cooperation and multilateralism. US President Donald Trump also attended and delivered a speech that was tough on European allies that he had threatened with new tariffs. Other speakers included the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and French President Emmanuel Macron. Now, to discuss all of this, I am joined by Victor Gao. He is Chair Professor at Soochow University. With us too is Anthony Chan. He is a former Chief Economist at JPMorgan Chase & Company. Also joining the discussion is Liang. She is Chair Professor in Economics at Willamette University. And with us too is Pieter Cleppe. He is Editor-in-Chief of the Brussels Report.eu. Welcome to all of you to the show. Victor, let's start with that address by Vice Premier He Lifeng at the forum. Here is some of what he had to say. Let's listen.
We are firm in supporting free trade and working together to promote economic globalization that is universally beneficial and inclusive. Economic globalization, representing the historical trend of global division of labor, cooperation, and mutual benefit, has significantly contributed to the development of China and many other countries. Conversely, tariff wars and trade wars have no winner. They not only raise global production and trade costs, but also fragment the global economy, undermining the optimal allocation of resources.
So, Victor, throughout the week, we've been hearing concerns about tariffs and the threats to free trade, as well as the threats posed to globalization. So how important right now is China as a stabilizing force?
Thank you very much for having me. I think the Davos meeting this year truly became a turning point in human history, because mankind now is faced with choices of war versus peace, confrontation versus cooperation, conquest and plundering other countries' assets and wealth versus treating all the other countries as equals. What China stands for is very clear. China defends free trade. China has now become the standard bearer of free trade, and China spares no effort in advocating free trade and defends free trade for the benefit of mankind as a whole, including, ironically, the legitimate interests of the American people. So I think we are really looking at a situation unfolding in front of everyone's eye, and there must be a choice between the right thing versus the wrong thing, the highway versus the low way.
Liang, in that address, Vice Premier He Lifeng warned that tariffs and trade wars have no winners. But listening to all those speakers over the week, did you get the sense that overall those attending that forum still support free trade, they still support globalization over a more protectionist and tariff-driven approach?
Yeah, good to be with you, Anand. I think He Lifeng's message is very well received. And again, I think that is a very stark contrast with Donald Trump's message. Instead of embracing kind of multilateralism, rule-based order, as well as consultation, women cooperation, I think Donald Trump's message is the opposite, right? Unilateralism, power politics, coercion, and so on. So I think the choice is very clear, I think, for the rest of the world. You hear the speeches by Mark Carney, by the German Chancellor, and by Emmanuel Macron, the French president. I think many of the speeches, I think, point to the same thing, which is countries want to defend the multilateral system. They are opening for trade, investments, cooperation. Now, I think, of course, the previous so-called rule-based order has never really existed or worked well for the global South countries. But I agree with Victor that now it's an inflection point, because even within the Western countries, within the sort of U.S. center orbit, countries find that this current sort of situation is not going to work well with the United States simply breaking the rule and impose all these unilateral sort of demand on other countries. And I think, He Lifeng's speech really emphasizes 2 points. One is that China's growth is through reform, opening, and innovations, not any kinds of, sort of beggar the neighbor or any sort of predatory practices. And second, I think it's important that China's growth and development presents opportunities. And that is not only about trade, but also investments, as well as the kinds of consultation, negotiation base to solve any trade disputes or any disagreements, again, rather than turning into coercion and unilateral actions.
So Liang, as you say, China's growth provides opportunities. So what is it going to take to steer the world back onto the path of multilateralism and globalization and free trade?
Well, I think, of course, sending this message is important, right? China has been talking the talk, but it's also China has been walking the walk. So I think, for one, is China has been unilaterally opening its economy by lowering tariffs, by reducing, for example, negative list of the foreign direct investment. China is also going out to invest in other countries, right? The cumulative outward foreign direct investment is $1.7 trillion, and China has been establishing enterprises abroad, 50,000 of them, over 190 countries. And these enterprises help to create jobs abroad, on average 2 million jobs per year. And of course, also help to transfer technologies and build up supply chain at the local level. So I think a lot of these show that China is determined to uphold the kinds of multilateral system. But last but not the least, I think it's really important, as you ask how China is able to help to stabilize and also lead this kinds of return back to sort of multilateralism. Again, I think it is in the common interest in the rest of the world. And that's why you're seeing, the European leaders talking about, building trade agreements with Mercosur. You're also hearing, Canada's Prime Minister just came to China and reached agreements on more open and free trade, as well as other kinds of trade agreements in the rest of the world. So I think China is also helping to facilitate a lot of these bilateral, multilateral agreements. Not to mention, I think in various multilateral platforms, be it BRICS, SCO, and others, I think China is playing the lead role and try to embrace and uphold the kind of multilateral trade, investment, and technological sharing kind of system.
Right, I'm going to get to Mark Carney's address in just a moment. But Anthony Chan, let's talk about Europe. Trump went after European leaders, after European countries as well. These are United States allies that he went after. And as the New York Times reported, and I'm quoting from the Times here, it said he vowed to advance his trade war and characterized tariffs as the price of admission to a land of 300 million consumers. What do you make of those comments? What does it tell us about future U.S. trade policy, especially when it comes to things like tariffs?
Well, I think that the President of the United States has made it very clear that he wants to maintain a solid advantage against not only Europe, but really the rest of the world, because he hates trade deficits, not realizing that these trade deficits are imposed because in a free world, everyone produces to their best ability, and comparative advantage means that we are buying things at a lower price from other countries than we could produce them ourselves. So those trade deficits are not necessarily as negative as the president sees them. But the reality is that when you look at this kind of environment, it almost looks like the president feels a burden to do something about trade deficits, to do something about maintaining an advantage, when the reality is that these tariffs are not the right way to go. If you want to gain the advantage, make the country be more efficient and increase productivity and things of that nature, but not do this through tariffs. And of course, in the real world, almost every country uses some sort of an advantage to be able to, I don't want to say cheat, but to be able to gain an advantage over other countries. But when you impose these kinds of tariffs, it goes well beyond that. It goes well beyond having some subsidies for companies or industries to be able to gain an advantage. This goes well beyond that, and I think the rest of the world is really standing up to this kind of pressure. And And frankly speaking, the rest of the world is basically saying we're not going to take this much longer.
Right. The thing is, Anthony, I take your point about, Trump being concerned about the deficits, but is he also using tariffs for foreign policy goals?
Well, there's no question, because he's using these tariffs to make sure that America stays powerful, America stays first, but it is really not the right way to go. In order to be strong and in order to stay ahead, you just have to be more efficient, you have to grow faster, and that's how you make a nation a lot more efficient. But one thing, Anand, that I found very interesting, and that is that once it became very clear that Europe buys or has assets of about $8 trillion of our equities in the United States and our debt, and that somehow if they were to mechanize, weaponize that sort of asset base and start selling those things, it would not be a very pretty picture for U.S. Equity markets, and probably not a pretty picture for U.S. Credit markets. And in fact, we did see the 10-year U.S. Treasury rate go up. And of course, you heard some explanations by the Treasury Secretary that it was simply because of disruptions in the Japanese market. But the reality is, I think that was an early warning that if somehow the rest of the world decided to dump U.S. assets, whether it be treasuries or equities, or just pursue that sell America trade more aggressively, it would not be a good thing. And I think that led to the realization that maybe compromising and making some sort of a grand deal was better than to certainly go in there and be more aggressive about the situation to get your way.
Right. Pieter Cleppe, in that address and at other times in Davos, President Trump made very derogatory comments about Europeans, and that's caused a lot of anger in Europe as well. I mean, he also made those threats, which were subsequently walked back, about imposing tariffs on countries that don't go along with his plan to buy Greenland. Here is what the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, had to say when those threats were made. Let's listen.
The European Union and the United States have agreed to a trade deal last July. And in politics, as in business, a deal is a deal. And when friends shake hands, it must mean something.
So, Pieter, as I said, President Trump did subsequently walk back those threats to impose tariffs. But is this causing or continuing to cause concern in Europe, as well as contribute to instability there?
Well, yes, absolutely. So what Trump did was seen as completely unacceptable. It's one thing to want to buy Greenland, to make a fair offer for it. It's one thing to impose all these tariffs, which he did last year. In the context of a perception that there's a trade deficit or a trade surplus that needs to be corrected, some shady economic theories. I mean, that's one thing, especially given the fact that Trump then tuckled, that he walked back these threats. At the end of the day, it wasn't the end of the world. It's very different to threatening allies with not only tariffs, but also with potential military action. Trump did not exclude that. And why did Trump quickly back down? I think the Europeans were a lot more firm than last year. They said, look, sorry, we cannot accept this, and we are going forward with a trade war if you start one. Secondly, I think within the Republican Party, people have told him, look, this is not a good idea. 90%, almost 90% of Americans are against taking territory of an ally, or any territory probably, by means of the U.S. Army. Maybe indeed the markets, that's hard to say. The situation of Japan played a big role, but we do see that after Trump backed down, that the markets went up again. So it probably also was one of the factors.
Victor Gall, let's talk about that address by the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. That was an address that got a lot of attention, not just in Davos, but around the world. It was seen and was presented as something of a counterweight to the views that are coming out of Washington. We heard Mark Carney warn there of a rupture in the global order. I mean, Mark Carney was also recently in China. At the end of his visit to China, there were several major trade agreements that were signed. So does all this uncertainty that we are seeing make China's role as the world's second largest economy even more important right now?
First of all, I think Prime Minister Carney's important speech in Davos will be remembered as one of the most important speeches in human history. Why? Because it really marked a turning point in human history. And from his speech, I think the West in particular and the world at large will realize what the United States is truly, what is the United States is really up to. And the current administration in Washington is bent upon plundering the assets of other countries, violating the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other countries, completely disregarding international law, and try to dictate terms without fair consultation with the counterparties. I think, historically speaking, the beginning of the year of 2026 will be remembered as the beginning of the end of Pax Americana, because the United States is really going down in a free fall from the so-called top of the mountain, plunging directly into the abyss of the law of the jungle. And I think history also will remember this period as the beginning of Pax Zhonghua or Pax Sinica, because now mankind has a choice. They know China is doing the right thing, defending free trade and defending equality among all nations and respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity of everyone in the world. And the United States really just throws its weight around, trying to bully other countries, hold a gun at the head of other countries. So I think we are truly living through a very important transformative period in human history. And Prime Minister Carney's remarks, very rational, very much to the point, and very much in light of everything he can think about. As a well-trained, very successful central banker before, and as the Prime Minister of one of the most staunch allies of the United States ever after the end of the Second World War. So Prime Minister Carney is speaking the truth, is speaking his mind. And everyone in the world, everyone in the West in particular, really need to heed what Prime Minister Carney said in Davos and keep what his message very much in their mind. You need to use your brain to decide whether the United States is doing the right thing or the wrong thing before you blindly follow its leadership. The U.S. leadership is collapsing in front of our eyes.
Anthony Chan, we have seen that when the president talks about tariffs, the markets take a hit. And I think it's fair to say that much of what the president has been saying, like announcing the threat of tariffs against European countries and then withdrawing those tariffs, is pretty erratic. But to what extent is that still driving uncertainty and instability in the United States?
Well, there's no question that it drives uncertainty, Anand. As you are well aware, the big buzzword in the United States today is affordability. And of course, that big study that came out of the Kegel Institute suggested that and found that 96% of all the tariffs that the United States has imposed are, in fact, the burden of U.S. entities, whether it be U.S. businesses or whether it be U.S. consumers. So in the world where we have a K-shaped recovery, where consumers are struggling to buy homes, they're struggling to meet everyday expenses, to then have to consider additional tariffs, and those are the ones that were threatened, would make the situation a lot worse and raise uncertainty in the United States. And that's why the financial markets react the way they do, because these tariffs are actually hurting the United States rather than helping. Now, even in the fourth quarter of this year, the expectations are that the U.S. is going to have over 5% growth. The Atlanta Fed nowcast model is projecting 5.4%, but you got to ask yourself, why is that happening? Because the projection is that the United States is importing less And the reason they're importing less is because with these tariffs, the products are a lot more expensive. So not only does it increase inflation, but it doesn't allow these consumers to buy these products. So it actually hurts us. So even though the headline GDP numbers are going to come in a little bit stronger, they're coming in stronger for the wrong reason, because consumers are buying less. And that means that consumers are not as well off. They're worse off because of this. And the affordability issue gets worse. So yes, I agree with you entirely. That uncertainty is going to increase if you see these tariffs accelerate from here.
Right. Jan Liang, we heard the head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. She said that trade is like a river and that water gets around obstacles when you put obstacles in front of it. Now, you know, we see this era of shifting alliances. I mean, are we going to see more and more countries diversifying whom they trade with and diversifying their economic and trade relationships with other countries, as well as seeking new markets?
Absolutely. I think we're seeing this unfolding right in front of us. When we actually look at trade last year, 2024, in 2024, world trade actually has expanded, right? 2025, it's likely that I think the world trade also has expanded. When you look at $33 trillion of worth of global trade, when service trade grew at 9%, you know, merchandise trade grew at 2%, we're seeing countries are finding ways to diversify the trading partners. They're trying to find new sort of markets, right, to both import and export. So I think it's clear, even if the United States does not join the kind of international trading system, of course, at their own expense, I think the rest of the world are looking forward to more trade because in many ways, trade helps to build more resilient supply chain, also help to bring more efficiency to their production. So I think this is a clear trend. Now, again, I think there are definitely things that need to be worked on. For example, the WTO, many of these multilateral trading system is not working very well. And I also agree that, you know, in terms of industrial policies and other matters, I think there should be some kind of consensus. There should be some kind of rules that countries can be abide by. So I think this is important, that it's not that we're going to abandon trade just because the United States does not, you know, like the way the trade has been conducting. I think the point is really to try to find new partners and to come up with new rules that would help to improve the trade terms. Now, going back to the question I think Anthony mentioned earlier, when it comes to financial kind of sort of well, not necessarily competition, but in the ways of having weaponization of the financial system, I think for Europe, it's difficult in the sense that even though they do have about $8 to $12 trillion worth of the U.S. Securities, most of these are held by the private hands, and these private entities have their own incentives to hold those assets as collaterals and to provide liquidity. So it's difficult for them to have a collective action of dumping the U.S. assets. Not to mention, I think the Fed could always step in and help to stabilize the market. But that said, I think it is a wake-up call that over-reliance on the U.S., including the dollar-centered financial system, provides a lot of, I think, vulnerability to the rest of the world. So I think the agenda is well set that we need to diversify, and I think that is also McCarthy's message that countries, even their traditional U.S. allies, strategic diversification is important. And I think that is not only about trade relationships, investment, but also when it comes to financial system.
Right, Pieter Cleppe, we look at how the Europeans have responded to Trump's threats, and in many respects, they appear to have taken the gloves off. I mean, they use less than diplomatic language in some instances. Let's listen to the French President, Emmanuel Macron.
I mean, it doesn't make sense to have tariffs and be divided, and even to threaten now with additional tariffs. We can use the crazy thing is that we can be put in a situation to use the anti-coercion mechanism for the very first time vis-à-vis the US if they put additional tariffs. Can you imagine that? This is crazy. This is, I do regret that, but this is a consequence of just unpredictability and useless aggressivity.
So, Pieter, what are the kinds of options that Europe has to respond to the United States? I mean, as Jan Liang pointed out, yes, Europeans hold a great deal of securities, but most of that is in private hands. Governments do actually have a lot of U.S. debt. But how would Europe weaponize that?
Well, First of all, if you talk about the securities, even if European governments would sort of coerce those private actors to dump U.S. treasuries, it would blow back because the world economy runs on the US dollar, and there's no way that Europe can use this, I think. I may be wrong, but it looks like something really experimental, very dangerous. So I don't think that's on the table in any way. If you're talking about the anti-coercion instrument, that could sort of take a whole lot of forms, basically more tariffs, all kinds of restrictions. But Europe is wary to use that. There was absolutely no consensus to use that. And, the response to Trump has been actually quite ambiguous. Some countries like France were more aggressive, others more diplomatic.
Victor Gao, very quickly, I've only got a minute left, but in that address, the Vice Premier He Lifeng, he said that China aims not only to be the world's factory, but also to be the world's market. So how will China's high-quality development deliver on that?
Well, China is the only country in the world of today which actually organizes an annual import-export. So China encourages all the countries, all the exporters, everywhere in the world to come to China's door and do your best to sell your goods and products and commodities to China. This is the right way. China does not seek imbalance in its trade in goods with the rest of the world. China aims to achieve balanced trade. Now, how to achieve that? It takes the two to tango. He Lifeng also said one point. It's not the case that China does not have demand for products made in Europe. It is the fact that Europeans actually refuse to sell things that China wants to buy from Europe. So you cannot blame China for the trade deficit that Europe suffers in its trade with China. It takes two to tango.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.